Hello everyone, my name is Lee and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I want to talk about one of my favorite shows of all time, quite possibly my favorite show of all time, which you can see is back here in VHS form and also DVD form. But I want to talk about Band of Brothers, which is my favorite show of all time, and I think is truly a beautiful, wonderful masterpiece of the ages. So I love this show so much. However, there are a lot of inaccuracies. And you may be thinking that there can't possibly be that many inaccuracies, right? I mean, they talked to the veterans. They put all that stuff together, didn't they? But they changed a lot. It's a fictionalized account of real events. And it's important to remember that. Because you may think that it's a documentary or it's supposed to be like a documentary, but it's not. It's supposed to be entertaining and Hollywood esque. A lot of the actual veterans actually didn't fully enjoy the experience and said that it should have been different, including Winters and Malarkey. Malarkey personally didn't like how Hollywood they made it all. He said that it was like too Hollywood and shouldn't have been that way, but they also said that it was fine for what it was. They did a lot of inaccuracies, and in today's video, I'm here to talk about a few of them. Now, this is not going to be all of the inaccuracies, and that's an important thing to remember. It's not going to be every single one because there's a lot, but it's going to be the ones that I personally want to talk about today. There is a high possibility of me making a second video for this and talking about more inconsistencies and things that they got wrong. So let's get into it, shall we? So I have a little book here that has all of my little things that I want to talk about. And the first thing that I want to talk about, because it's one of the things that I personally think is the most egregious of a change, and it's what they did to Kenneth Webb. Now, you may not remember him right away, but he here shows up in, I believe, episode 7. Yes, he shows up in episode 7 as a replacement that knows nothing. He's so confused about everything. He doesn't really know anything. He doesn't know any of the guys. He doesn't know anything that's happened. He's just completely new, very young, very innocent, kind of stupid. And then he dies during the Battle of Foy after he gets shot by a sniper. They changed basically everything about Kenneth Webb, and I'm going to tell you what's wrong with it. So, here we go. Kenneth Webb was born in 1920 in New York. He joined Easy Company at Toccoa. That's right, he was a Toccoa man. He was with them all throughout the entire war. He was a Toccoa man, and they made him a replacement. And on top of that, his family said that his personality had been totally changed in the show. He was a very intelligent, serious young man who was just, he was very, very serious and made sure that he stayed focused on what he was supposed to be doing. And that's the type of guy he was. Very serious, very smart, just generally very intelligent. And a Toccoa man. He wasn't a replacement at all. In no capacity was he a replacement. He ran Currahee with them. He wasn't a replacement, but they made him a replacement. For whatever reason, they decided to make him a dumb replacement who didn't know anything and didn't know anybody. For whatever reason, meanwhile, there were actually guys who showed up at Bastogne, but they don't talk about any of those guys, which also leads into my next point. But Kenneth Webb is one of the biggest most egregious changes to me, because they changed him so severely just for, in my opinion, shock value of his later death. Because you see this kid come in and you're like, oh my god, he's so young. He doesn't know anything. He doesn't know what's going on. He's so young. He shouldn't be here. He was a Toccoa man. And mind you, they're all young. The oldest member of Easy Company, the two oldest members of Easy Company were Joseph Liebgott and Roy Cobb, who both were 30 in 1945. They were the oldest members of Easy Company. At 30. And they bring in Webb as this young kid but he wasn't. They completely changed him, which I think is so strange because that's not his story at all. Which then leads into my next point, which is about John Julian and John Janovic. Julian shows up and dies in episode 6, Bastogne. However, he came in at the same time as Babe Heffron, Les Hashi, Tony Garcia, and James Miller. They all showed up at the same exact time. But instead of having that, they made him come in during Bastogne and made him be this completely new, innocent guy. Now, according to Babe Heffron in Bill Garnier's book, according to Babe Heffron, he said that Julian was a very sweet, nice kid. He was young, he was very nice, and he was very polite. He was born in 1924 in Sipsey, Alabama, which they also kind of leave out that he was from a rural Alabama town, and he would not have sounded the way he sounded. And they completely changed that. They also kind of took away him and Babe being best friends because they were. Babe and Julian were best friends since training. They met during training and became best friends there, and then they entered Easy Company together and went along that way. But they took that away. They changed that, instead making him this new kid that shows up that is kind of doofy and is just really, really young and sweet. Julian was 20 years old at the time of his death, and the actor they had playing him was 18. Mark Ryan Jordan was 18 at the time of filming. Which is not that big of an age difference, really, if you think about it. But they deliberately made him look younger in order to really sell in that specific, again, shock factor of his death. He and Babe were best friends. I need to say it again. They were best friends. And Babe talks about him at length in his book. Babe's children said that wintertime and Christmas time, especially because that's around the time that Julian died, was in December of 1944, Babe completely shut down around the holidays. He could not celebrate Christmas. He never celebrated Christmas again, or New Year's. He never celebrated Christmas or New Year's because that was the day they found his body. And he never celebrated those holidays ever again. Because of Julian. Because, not just because he saw him die in front of him, which I'm sure was a big factor, but it was also because they were best friends. But they changed that for some reason. I, again, don't know why they changed that. On a similar note, John Janovic showed up and jumped with them in Market Garden. In the show, he appears for the first time in episode 9, Why We Fight. At the very beginning of episode 9, that's when he shows up. And then he dies in episode 10. John Janovic was born in 1925. He was 19 years old at the time of his death, and he jumped into Market Garden. He fought in Holland. He was wounded in Holland. And they completely took that out, again, making him into a replacement who comes in at the same time as O'Keefe. Which personally I don't understand, because you already have this character who's brand new, who you have this guy who shows up, he's completely new. He comes in and you have that sort of essence of character in O'Keefe. You don't need to also have that essence of character with Janovic, because Janovic fought in Market Garden. According to Webster's book, which I have up here and I've read, Webster and Janovic were best friends. They both joined the company at the same time, with Janovic being a replacement and Webster being a transfer. And they became very close because they both complained a lot, and they were both complainers. They were able to complain to each other without the other getting annoyed. There's even a part in Webster's book where he talks about how he and Janovic always shared a foxhole. They always shared a foxhole. They were always together. And at one point they dug in and like prepared their hole for bedtime. You know, like they covered it up and they put their blankets down and they got all ready, and then Peacock came in and ruined that for Webster, who hated him, but that's for another day. And but they completely took that out. They not only took out Janovic being a Market Garden veteran and being wounded, but even his friendship with Webster, they completely took it away. And then they made it at the end when Janovic dies, because that is how he died. They had it be that Webster was just there, that they'd just been talking, and that was the craziest part to him. Meanwhile, in Parachute Infantry, Webster was out of his mind with grief after the loss of Janovic. Again, not just because he saw it happen and not just because the war was over, but because that was one of his closest friends and he was just gone. But they took that away. They changed that. They took it away, and I'm not really sure why. I'm sure there's a reason. There's some production reason that I don't understand. But I personally don't think they should have changed it. I think they should have let Janovic be there. And I just don't really understand the point of the change. Since we're talking about Market Garden, let's talk about some of the other things that they changed about their time in Holland. First off, the way that Winters and Webster describe the Crossroads battle. In Webster's book, he describes it as this just horrific battle where he was crawling through blood and muck to get away from what he thought was certain death. And this is after he was shot through the leg. Now, in his book, he describes it as being feeling like he was hit through the leg with a railroad spike. And I wasn't sure if he meant that literally or if it was like a metaphor for how he was feeling about it. I'm not entirely sure. But either way, it was awful. It was horrible pain that he described. And because he said that it was like someone swung a bat with a spike in it and hit him with it. That's what he said that it was. So again, I don't know if that was literal or metaphorical, but either way, it was not a good time. And Winters describes it as like the best tactical thing he ever did. And like he was so proud of this, which what they did was impressive, taking the two companies of SS. That was very impressive. But the way he talks about it as if nothing went wrong is kind of crazy to me, especially because Dukeman died. Dukeman died, and, you know, Webster was wounded in a very horrible way, at least according to him. And then you've also got like Liebgat was wounded, and all these people, a lot of people were wounded in this battle. And the only person who died was Dukeman. So they kind of were like, oh, it comes out in the wash. You know, it's fine. Which is whatever. But that's just a difference in how they explain things. which does lead into a later point that I have, which I will talk about in a bit, but I do want to say another thing about Market Garden is that there is a deleted scene that they completely took out of the show and completely wrote away. Is that Luz got wounded in Holland. Now I know. Don't they say in episode 7 that Luz has never been hit? In the breaking point, he's never been hit. Wrong. He got wounded in Holland and had a Purple Heart for it. Luz has a Purple Heart from getting wounded in Holland. But they completely wrote that out. Completely. To make, jolly old St. Luz, Lucky Luz, come into play. But he'd been wounded. And it wasn't an egregious wound. He was able to come back. And it was from what you see in the deleted scene here, it was a wound to the thigh, right? And changed that around. But you know what? That was a little thing they changed. And again, they changed so much that the things I'm listing aren't even everything. Now, of course, I have more to talk about in this video, but there's so much that they changed that I don't really know why they changed it. I am a little confused about it, but whatever. Not my business. In Webster's book, Parachute Infantry, he talks about all of the men in his platoon. I'm going to read who was in his platoon, and we're going to talk about who's actually in the show and who's not, and my opinion on why I think they changed it. First, you have Robert Rader, who was the sergeant of his platoon. Don Hubler, who is in the show. Pace, Massaconi, Lyle, Talbert, who is the platoon sergeant. Janovic, Miller, as in James Miller, the same one. You've got Rice, Wetzel, Wiseman, Meth, who was a cook and who joined them for the Holland jump. But out of all of those guys, not very many of them are actually in the show. Including Rader, who was one of their sergeants and had been the entire war. He was a Toccoa man. And about Rader, who I think should have been included. And now I don't know if there's something out there that is from like his family or him that was like, I don't want to be in any show. But he died in 1997, so I don't think he said that he didn't want to be in the show that came out in 2001. But anyway, Rader, Robert Rook Rader, which is a very cool nickname, by the way. Rook is super cool. Was born in Manchester, Ohio in 1923. Manchester, Ohio, which is also where Hubler is from. And Howell, William Shep Howell, who was also not included in the show. Those three were best friends. They were thick as thieves, the three of them. Specifically, Rader and Hubler were best friends. Best friends. If Rader was the sergeant, Hubler was his corporal. They were best friends. They grew up together. They were in the same school. Like all of this stuff. And if you look at how many people live in Manchester and lived in Manchester in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, not a lot. There's not a lot of people that lived there. The three of them were known as the Three Hillbillies because they were all from Appalachia and they had very Appalachian accents. They were from a rural town in southern Ohio with, in Appalachia. They called themselves the Three Hillbillies, and everyone made fun of them for their accents. But they rolled with it. They rolled with it because it was just part of who they were, which I think is cool and awesome. Good for them. Raider should have been included in the show. And again, I don't understand why he wasn't. He was known from the men as their best sergeant. They loved Raider. A lot of them credited Raider with being the reason why they survived the war at all. They said that Raider was the reason they survived the war. And they didn't include him? They didn't include him in the show. For whatever reason. Which I personally think is because of Winters. Because Winters, in my humble opinion, didn't like it when anyone else was framed as a good leader. Because he wanted to be the only one known as being a good leader to Easy Company. Which you can tell by how he talks about everybody and how everything goes down. It's all because Winters' biases bleed into the entire show. Because he had very specific biases. He was notably very misogynistic and he was racist. Okay? There's notes from him. I don't want to say the word, but he says it and it's disgusting. Calling an Italian soldier a word that starts with D because of his skin tone. Because he was the wrong kind of Italian and too dark. You're a blonde from Pennsylvania! And all of what I'm saying is not to say that these guys weren't war heroes, because they were. Winters was a war hero. He was an amazing tactician. They still talk about Breakwar Manor for a reason. All of this stuff, right? You can be a war hero and still be an asshole. There is a letter that he sent to his, at the time, girlfriend, Dieta Allman. I'm still talking about Winters. Where she mentioned that she gained 2 pounds. Mind you, this woman had joined the army. She was a WAC. She was in army training. And this motherfucker wrote back to her, 2 pounds? You training for the football season? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? Huh? What is this? Mind you, Dieta Allman was a very beautiful woman. But also, who talks like that? Who talks like that to your girlfriend and or fiance? I can't remember. Who talks like that? What? So this is what I was saying, that his biases and his favorites were the only ones who made it in to the show. The people that he liked were the ones who made it in. He didn't like Raider. He didn't like Gordon Carson, who was one of the biggest contributors to the Band of Brothers book, because he gave Stephen Ambrose his journal from training, from wartime. He gave him his journal, and his journal was used in Band of Brothers, the book. But you know who's not in the show? Gordon Carson. Forrest Guth isn't in the show either. There's so many of them that were left out for whatever reason, and I think it's because of Winters. Because the show itself was headlined by Winters. The book had a bunch of different guys talking about things. But if Winters didn't like you, you weren't getting added. And honestly, I gotta say, Smokey's lucky he got in there. Smokey Gordon, he's lucky he got in there. because he didn't like Winters by the end of his life because of how Winters treated Talbot, which is a whole other story. But Smokey Gordon didn't like Winters, and Winters knew that. And Smokey died in 1997. So I think he's lucky he got in the show. He's lucky that he got in there because I think that Winters probably would have left him out. I'm just saying. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I've got my tinfoil hat on, but I think that's what's going on. Which again leads into my next point, which is Herbert Sobel. In the show, now I'm sure a lot of you heard me say that, and then we're like, ew, Sobel. Because that's what they want you to think about him. But no! Sobel made Easy Company what it was. Because he knew that he turned them all against him on purpose so that they would be united. That's what happened. He made them united against him, which made Easy Company known for the camaraderie and the closeness that they had because they all hated Sobel. But also, they didn't all hate Sobel. They didn't. You know who didn't? Very notably didn't hate Sobel and actually liked Sobel? Gordon Carson, which is again why he's not in the fucking show. Garnier liked Sobel. He said that he wasn't a bad dude. He was just kind of a difficult leader, which they needed. They needed a difficult leader. Because imagine, they're all college age kids. A lot of them who'd never left their home before. Like they never left their town before in their entire lives. And now here they are in a different state and then a different country. They're unbelievable. They needed to be corralled in some sort of way. So Sobel had to corral them like a TA. That's what he was. Or an RA? Is that? I don't know. I don't live in a dorm. But the one, like the dorm manager or whatever. That's what he was like for them. Yeah, he was their leader, and he was the one that turned them into Easy Company. They would not have been the famous Easy Company that we know without Sobel. If Winters had been their leader from the start, not a chance. There's not a chance that they would have the same story. And then you get into the tricky stuff with Sobel. A lot of the descriptions about Sobel are deeply rooted in anti-Semitism. Sobel was notably Jewish. Everyone knew he was Jewish. He had the stereotypical appearance of a Jewish person. He was Jewish. And if you read the book Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose, the way Stephen Ambrose describes Sobel is anti-Semitic. The way that Smokey Gordon talks about Sobel is anti-Semitic. The things that they said about him, all of the ways that they described him in a negative way were rooted in anti-Semitism because they hated Jewish people. So in turn, they hated Sobel. You see the line there? You see how that all connects? A lot of people think of anti-Semitism as a distinctly Nazi problem, especially during World War II. However, it was rampant everywhere. Jewish soldiers were being treated horribly on their own front lines. They were, a lot of them were put into specific jobs, or they, like, just all of this different stuff happened because people were anti-Semitic. Because the thing is that America did not, the United States did not join World War II to fight the Nazis. That's not exactly what happened. That's what ended up happening. But they joined World War II because Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. That's why the United States joined World War II. Originally, we were just going to go fight the Japanese in the Pacific. But then we ended up in the European theater as well. You see how that all connects? Which doesn't have anything to do with the inconsistencies in Band of Brothers. I got a little carried away. My bad. My bad. I'm very passionate about World War II history, if you couldn't tell by my shelves here. But I digress. I digress. A lot of the anti-Sobel stuff is based on anti-Semitism, which you actually look at how they talk about Sobel, you can see that. And it's bad. It's bad. It's not good. It's real bad. Because don't do that. Don't do that. And again, I'm not saying that Sobel was a good person. Because from accounts from his, from his family, he was troubled. He was a troubled man who was very bitter at the end of his life. He was very angry that his son didn't want to join the army, and was especially angry that that same son was a hippie. Because, in the 70s. He was very angry that he was a hippie and didn't want to join the army and go fight in Vietnam. Which then led to his children cutting him off, and none of them went to his funeral. None of his children or his ex-wife went to his funeral when he died. Which is sad. I think it's sad. He was a deeply troubled man, and apparently was quite conservative. Which is also true about Liebgott. Liebgott. Hold on. Okay, he wasn't on my list, but I need to talk about Liebgott because there's quite a few inconsistencies with Liebgott. So, Joe Liebgott was very, very different in the show. First of all, he's not Jewish at all, actually. He was Roman Catholic, raised Roman Catholic. He raised his children Roman Catholic. His entire family was Catholic. Never Jewish. Never Jewish at any point. What happened is that he looked Jewish. So they said that he looked Jewish, the other men. And when they said he was Jewish, he just never corrected them because he thought it was funny. And because they also thought he was Jewish, not just for his looks, but also because of how much he hated Germans and how much he hated Nazis. So they thought he was Jewish because of that. But he wasn't. Which apparently is something that his children were very surprised by when they learned about it later. Anyway. Also, Liebgott never ever drove a cab. That didn't happen. He was a barber before the war and was a barber after the war until he died. Yeah, he was a barber. He was not a cab driver at any point in his life. Which I think is a little funny. That they were like, Joe Liebgott went back and drove his cab. He didn't do that. He didn't do that at all, actually. He was a hairdresser, barber. That's what he did. Also, after the war, Liebgott disappeared for a while. His own family didn't know he was alive. Yeah. He got married, had 8 children, which is crazy. And none of his children and his wife, from my knowledge at least, had no idea that he served in the war at all. And my thought is like it had to have come up at some point because it's very fresh in people's memories and like I mean these children would probably do what school projects or something because I remember I've done school projects where it's like if you have a veteran in your family or if you know a World War II veteran, if you know a Vietnam veteran, why don't you have a conversation with them? Like stuff like that, you know? Like so that had to have been a thing that they did, right? But so my only guess is that he lied. I don't know that he lied about it. I was like, yeah, no, it was a 4F. Meanwhile, no. But it was just something that was just his way of coping, you know. Everyone had their own way of coping. Some turned to drinking, some completely pretended the war didn't happen, etc., etc. Now, Liebgott, also on Liebgott, he was apparently a very, very, very conservative man. And I mean that in a very negative way. He was apparently very racist. Like, very racist. So much so that his uh, children were surprised about how much he hated the Nazis. Like, they were genuinely a little, like, gobsmacked that he hated Nazis because his views were that radical, which is not good. Very bad. Um, very, very bad. But I find interesting, you know, how someone can change so quickly. But I guess not change because I don't know what he was. I didn't meet the guy, so I don't know. I don't know what he was like before the end of the war. You know, other than what the guys have said about him. Also, that he drank a lot. He was very angry his entire life. He struggled a lot, but didn't ever tell anyone why. So they just kind of thought he was crazy, basically. But you know, that's just how it is. And yeah. At the end of his life, he only had one child that was still talking to him. One out of 8. Bad ratio. Um, and yeah. So when Band of Brothers came out, and one of his children saw it, and we're like, hey, wait a minute. Liebgott Joseph D. That's our dad. That's our dad. That looks like our dad. That's our dad's name. All that stuff, you know. And so they went into his attic, and he'd been dead for a couple years by this point. They went to his attic and they found his jump wings and they found the Easy Company scrapbook that he still had. He didn't get rid of it. He still had it. And so they were like, so they found out and they contacted, they contacted the guy and they talked about it. But, which I just think is so fascinating that they were like, they found out that their dad served in World War II because of a show that came on. I just think it's interesting. I think it's a neat concept. Not a neat concept. That's not what I didn't mean to say that, but like interesting. It's interesting to me how that went down. I told myself I wasn't gonna get distracted, but I got distracted a little bit, but that's okay. Um so the last thing I think I'm going to talk about. The last thing I'm going to talk about is Spears. Spears. Ron Spears, who we all love. And honestly, I've never read anything about him that's made me be like, because sometimes you read stuff about the real guys and you're like, why would you do that? Or why would you say that? Or why is that a thing? Or that's gross or something like that. But I have literally never ever felt that about Spears reading his stuff. So shout out Spears. Good for you. Original feminist. Anyway, he was. I'm not even lying. He was. Like you can tell by how he treated women. Anyway, they changed a lot about Spears. A lot. So in the show, he's very like serious, which Spears was very serious in real life. Don't get me wrong, but he also smiled a lot. He was a happy guy. He's apparently very good for conversation. Like he's very chill. Like he was a leader that they all loved. Everyone loved Spears. The only ones who didn't were Winters and Talbert, and that's because Talbert was constantly up Winters' butt and only liked Winters. There are a couple things about Spears that didn't actually happen. Like he didn't shoot those POWs. He didn't do that. That was just a thing they changed. Even Malarkey was like, yeah, he didn't do that. Um, they just changed that. They made that happen, I think, to make him seem scarier and to like give that proof. You know, whatever. He did, however, shoot the sergeant in his own platoon. And here's why. It wasn't like they said in the show when they're gossiping that it was because the sergeant was drunk and didn't want to go on patrol. Which there's a little bit of truth in that, but here's what actually happened. The sergeant was drunk, refusing to go on patrol, but he also drew his weapon and was threatening to shoot. That's why Spears shot him. He didn't kill him. He shot him to stop him from hurting someone else. Specifically from hurting Spears because he was aiming at him. He did that in self-defense. He didn't just do that because the guy wasn't listening to him. He did it in self-defense, which they leave out. Basically, I think that they made him this like weird, scary guy because winners didn't like it when other people liked leaders that weren't him. He didn't like that. So he made them change Spears to be less likable, creepier. Kind of backfired because a lot of people really like Spears, me, myself included. I love Spears, and so I feel like that was kind of the intention there. Also because uh, Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg didn't get the answers they wanted out of Spears when they did his interview. Because what happened during the interview is that they were pressuring Spears a lot and kept pushing for answers about his first wife. Essentially trying to get him to badmouth her, but he kept refusing because he said, and he got to a point, he snapped and he said that she was a wonderful woman and a wonderful wife, a wonderful mother, and that even just because they didn't work out, because her husband literally like came back from the dead, which is a whole thing, that he was not going to badmouth her. That they raised their son together, separately but together, basically. Like raised their son. And Spears, by the way, was such a good father, even while not always being there because he was in, the army and lived in America. Mostly, kind of. We mostly lived in Europe. But that his son went on to join the military also. Because of Spears. Because of his father. And I'm sure both of his fathers, essentially. I'll say it this way. Both of his fathers. Because he was also being raised by his mother's husband, who was not his biological father. But I digress. Spears was a really good dude, and that's not even all of the really good things that he did. He was a really, really awesome dude. And everybody liked Spears. All of the dog company guys said that he was an absolutely amazing leader and that he really took care of them. And the Easy Company guy said the same thing. Johnny Martin loved Spears. First of all, Martin loved him. Loved that guy. Webster loved Spears. Like, they all liked Spears. He was a good dude. But they made him, like, awkward and weird and scary in the show. Anyway, I'm hungry, so I think I'm going to cut it off here. There are definitely more things that I could talk about and more, like, discrepancies and things that they changed. So maybe in another video I will talk about this. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you made it to the end, please leave a like and a comment about anything that your heart desires. And if you liked me, feel free to subscribe and see what else I have in store. Bye.